Now, the Subway Final Word.
Well, I'll tell you, when it was always our desire to do whatever we had to do to help somebody succeed.
Whatever it takes. Good evening, I'm Albie Oxenrider, and welcome to a special edition of The Final Word. This is the show that invites you, the fans, into the conversation, and tonight we're talking about the Emperor, Charles Henry Knoll, and let's start by introducing you to tonight's three panelists. All right, from 105.9 The X, the afternoon host, Mr. Mark Madden. Hi, Mark. From Trib Total Media, Dan Kovacevic in the middle, and Alan Robinson on the far right. Hi, gentlemen. Welcome to you both. Let's get started. You don't often hear Chuck Noll's name mentioned as the best coach of all time, but he's the only one with 4 Super Bowls. Does Chuck Noll get enough respect in the discussion of best all-time coaches? Alan, you're up first.
Of course he doesn't, and I don't think he really cares. Here's all you need to know. Chuck Knox won 3 NFL Coach of the Year awards. Chuck Noll won 0. He might have won in 72, except Don Shula just happened to have an unbeaten football team. In Pittsburgh, the players were the visible and glamour components, not the head coach. But who picked those players? Chuck Noll. One day after he got the job as coach, he made sure the Steelers drafted Joe Green. The next year, they were offered a huge package of players for the #1 pick. He said, no, we're taking Terry Bradshaw. Chuck Noll obviously did not get the credit he deserves. And you know, here's an interesting little sidelight. The football field nearest where Chuck Noll lived when he died in Sewickley, it's named for Chuck Knox.
Dan.
You know, a lot of times you'll hear arguments about so-and-so won X amount of rings as it relates to athletes. I think that's always a faulty comparison point when it comes to individual players. Not so with coaches. Coaches are about one thing, and that is about team success. There is only one ultimate team success. Chuck Noll has 4 rings. No one else has 4. That, to me, makes it beginning and end of conversation. The name that comes up the most is Vince Lombardi, and I think a lot of that is just the Lombardi mythos, the way he's been portrayed as larger than life, the fact that they won the first 2. Vince Lombardi had 9 Hall of Fame players on the Packers. He inherited 8 of those 9 players. Now again, that's not necessarily a knock on the guy, but we're comparing to Chuck Noll, who built the Steelers, the Super Steelers, from scratch. From 0, from 1 and 13. There's no comparison point. Chuck Noll, greatest football coach of all time, greatest Pittsburgh coach of all time in any sport.
Mark.
I have no doubt that Chuck Noll is the greatest football coach of all time. I also have no doubt that what Alan Robinson said is absolutely true. Chuck Noll could not possibly have cared less about how much credit he did or didn't get. As to why he's not held in the esteem Lombardi is, Bill Walsh is, I don't know. Lombardi was larger than life, like Dayon said, a caricature of a football coach in some ways. Bill Walsh was a technician. All Chuck Noll was the coach of the most ruthless, effective team in football history. There wasn't anything sexy about the Pittsburgh Steelers. They just came in and beat your brains out time after time after time. The way they played, the way they conducted themselves was a reflection of Chuck Noll. We hear endless bleating these days about how the standard is the standard. Chuck Noll set the standard. He lived the standard. He was the standard. When I was a kid and Chuck Noll coached the Steelers, when I became a young adult and Chuck Noll coached the Steelers, there was not one moment I ever felt ashamed of being a Pittsburgh Steeler fan. Everybody out there, look in the mirror after the show's over and ask yourselves if you could say the same thing these days.
All right, Mark, Dan, and Alan, thank you. A reminder, keep the comments coming. You can find us on Twitter at WPXI Final Word, on Facebook at The Final Word. Gene says Coach Noll doesn't get enough respect, never will. Ironically, he never wanted it either. Thank you for the comment, Gene. Chuck Noll won 4 Super Bowls, but he was a true Renaissance man whose impact reached well beyond the football field. So we want to know, what will be the lasting legacy that Coach Noll will leave behind? Dan, we start with you this time.
The subject of my column in the Trib tomorrow is about the impact that Chuck Noll had on our city. And the argument that I make, plain and simple, is that when you look at that time span, and I was a child back then, but remember it vividly and the way a lot of other people do here, painfully, that was a terrible, terrible time for Pittsburgh. We were dying if we weren't already dead. The Steelers gave us that source of pride. The Steelers gave us that will to see Pittsburgh fight through this, to succeed. That's on Chuck Noll, because Chuck Noll, as we were just discussing, and Mark just stated very eloquently about his own experiences as a child, created that spirit in us. They created that energy and that passion for Pittsburgh when everybody else was dumping on it. To me, Chuck Noll, as you look around the city of Pittsburgh right now, is the reason for all of the successes, ultimately, because that was the pivoting point. That was when the city could have either gone down the drain and turned into a Detroit or a Buffalo or a Cleveland, or turned into the great place that it is today.
Mark?
If Chuck Noll doesn't coach the Steelers of the 70s, that dynasty doesn't happen. He was the least replaceable member. More so than Green, Bradshaw, Lambert, Ham, name all the names, Chuck Noll was more important. And like Dayon said, if that dynasty doesn't take place, Pittsburgh is a very different place today. How different? I don't know. How much worse? I don't know. But it would be worse, and Chuck Noll was the guy who made all of that happen. As far as his lasting legacy goes, Chuck Noll wasn't just a great football coach, he was a great man. Everything he did just screamed class. Again, I keep coming back to, he was a guy you could be proud to have coach your football team. Sports these days doesn't produce many guys that you can admire. Chuck Noll was one of those guys.
Alan?
Well, Chuck Noll's legacy is this. You know how they've always said that Pittsburgh isn't a baseball town, it's a football town. Well, before Chuck Noll, it wasn't a football town either. Chuck Noll's legacy is from 1 to 4 o'clock every Sunday afternoon, or from 4 to 7 o'clock every Sunday afternoon. The Steelers matter to this town, and they matter an awful lot. His legacy is the bumper stickers and the terrible towels and the jackets that everybody in town wears. That's his legacy. Before Chuck Noll, you could walk up to the stadium on game day and buy a ticket. You haven't been able to do that since 1972. That's Chuck Noll's legacy.
All right. Again, guys, thanks. And Chuck Noll's funeral will be held Tuesday morning at St. Paul Cathedral. When the subject of the greatest Steelers is brought up, you often hear the names Mean Joe Green, maybe Terry Bradshaw, Mel Blount, or Franco Harris. But should Chuck Noll be considered the greatest Steeler? Harvard player says yes, for sure. He wasn't called the Emperor for nothing. Started the Steeler dynasty to where it is today. Simply the best. The panel will debate that topic when we come back.
Now, the Subway Final Word.
Not much good happened before Chuck got here, and not much bad happened after he got here and after he left, because he really set the standard before the standard became the standard.
Craig Wolfley talking about the importance of Chuck Noll and what he meant to the Steelers organization. Welcome back to the Subway Final Word. I'm Albie Oxenrider with Mark Madden, Allen Robinson, Dan Kovacevic. We often think of players when we talk about the greatest Steelers, but does Chuck Noll transcend that? Should he be considered the greatest Steeler of all time? Mark, we're starting with you.
As I said earlier, Chuck was the most important member of the dynasty of the 70s, so I think it's obvious he's the greatest Steeler ever. When you look at offensive players for the Steelers, you can debate the 70s team, Bradshaw, Franco Harris, Swan, Stallworth, Mike Webster. There were so many great offensive players. On defense, Mean Joe Green, Jack Lambert, Jack Ham, Mel Blount. There were so many great defensive players. Moving forward, you can legitimately compare a Troy Polamalu to anybody who played defense on that team in the 70s. You can legitimately compare Ben Roethlisberger to Terry Bradshaw. No offense to Mike Tomlin. There's no comparing Mike Tomlin to Chuck Noll. There's no comparing Bill Cowher to Chuck Noll. He was one of a kind, the best coach in football history, the best coach in Steeler history, the most important man in Steeler history.
All right, Alan.
I'll just be the contrarian here because I've done a lot of research. into Steelers history this past spring. To me, it's Dan Rooney, just because if there was no Dan Rooney, there would have been no Chuck Noll. They probably would still every 3 years be hiring the different wrong coach, just like they did for the 30-plus years. The Steelers became viable as a franchise and as a force in the National Football League because of Dan Rooney, who to this day, I've been talking to some of the owners in the league this spring about Dan. He remains an unfathomable influence on this league. But Chuck Noll was part of that. The two are linked together. It was a great owner hiring a great coach, and you see what happened.
Well, Branch Rickey and Jackie Robinson were linked together too, but ain't nobody giving Branch Rickey more credit than Jackie, Al.
The very fact that we can look at the Steelers as a whole, and anytime you ask someone who was the greatest Steelers player of all time, the first reaction that you get is a pause, and then a longer pause, because you start thinking about some of those players that Mark just mentioned, and you eventually, in my mind anyway, you come back to Joe Green because he started it, because he was the anchor, he made the 9 Pro Bowls, he was part of all 4 championships, and everything else that Joe Green represented. But everything still comes back to Chuck Noll. It does. He was the man who found these guys. He was the man who molded the vision of what that team would look like. Mark mentioned earlier about the toughness of this team, about their relentlessness. That came from the coach. The coach knew exactly what kind of players he wanted. He knew exactly what kind of effect he wanted them to have on their opponents, which was to scare the daylights out of them. That emanates from the head coach. That vision hasn't changed to this day.
All right, when the Steelers take the field at training camp next month, it will, of course, be at Chuck Noll Field at St. Vincent College in Latrobe. There's no question Chuck Noll was a one-of-a-kind coach and man. What's your favorite Chuck Noll moment? Super 66 Mario says Jerry Glanville incident. He was scared to death of Chuck Noll. Our panel weighs in next on the Subway Final Word.
Now, the Subway Final Word.
He was really an incredible human being, extremely bright, very intelligent, very curious, very intellectual. He was a very, very special, unique person.
That's longtime Steelers PR man Joe Gordon. Welcome back to the Subway Final Word, paying tribute tonight to a legend, Chuck Noll. We want to know what's your favorite Chuck Noll moment. Allen Robinson, can you narrow it down to just one?
I can narrow it down to 150, and they were those Monday press conferences he used to have after games. This was before the guy from Bob's blog with 50 readers could ask a question. It was before they were televised and before it was on radio. It was just the writers who covered the team and a few TV people sat around a table on Monday morning and talked about the games. He was not very forthcoming. He wasn't always very expansive, but Chuck gave you information. You had to ferret it out. It was hidden and cloaked and veiled, and you had to discern it. It was a great contest. He knew what he was doing. He wasn't being condescending to the writers, but he was making them work for the information that he was offering to them. It was a lot of fun.
Mark?
Well, I did not know Chuck Noll well, and that will be to my everlasting regret. I only ran into him a couple times. He may have actually been smarter than me. That's a shocking admission for me to make about anybody, but it just might be true. But I ran into Chuck not long after I started my radio show. And I said, Mr. Noll, I'm Mark Madden. I do a radio show on 1250. And he goes, yeah. And he broke into this big Chuck Noll smile. He goes, I've heard your show. Very unusual. And I think that's the highest compliment that my show has ever been paid.
Dan.
Sounds like it should have been a slogan that stuck, Mark. You know, I never had the good fortune to meet Mr. Noll or to cover him. I did, however, over the last 24 hours with my brother who was in town, binge watch Steelers from the 70s on NFL Network all night long. And the more you see and you hear of Chuck Noll, you appreciate the wit that he would throw out at the right times in the most sardonic way. the tweeter earlier mentioned the Jerry Glanville incident. I'm partial to the one where Hollywood Henderson from the Cowboys was making fun of Terry Bradshaw's intellect. And Chuck Noll, who would never respond to these kinds of things at all, came back to reporters and said, empty barrels make the most noise. Now, if that's the only thing that you say on that subject, you've won the debate, you've won the argument. Just an incredible man. I think the more you hear about him from people who have experienced him firsthand, the more you appreciate even more that there are just no exceptions to the good words that come around.
All right, Chuck Noll once said, the key to winning a season is focusing on one opponent at a time, winning 1 week at a time, never look back and never look ahead. Well, we're looking ahead to the final word on Chuck Noll. Hazel 44 is a very simple final word, honorable. The panel's final word on Chuck Noll as the Subway final word continues.
Now, the Subway final word.
Welcome back. We need to take care of some business here, giving away 5 pairs of tickets to the Constellation Senior Players Championship to be held the week of June 23rd at Fox Chapel. Tonight's winners, John Comer, Julie Chiovitti, Tim Tyler, Dmitry Korobelnikov, and Robert Truver. Look for an email from us the next day or two with details on how to pick up those tickets. And it's not too late to win. Go to the Final Word webpage under the sports tab at WPXI.com to find out how to enter. You can also look for the link in our Facebook or Twitter pages. We're wrapping up our special show tonight on the legacy of Chuck Noll. Finally tonight, your final word on Chuck Noll. Dan?
Plain and simple, statue, North Shore soon, hopefully right by the Chief.
Mark?
Chuck Noll in the 70s didn't just coach the Steelers, he coached all of us, and we were all the better for it.
Alan?
Chuck Noll was just like the guy down the street because he was the guy down the street. He was from Cleveland, but he was one of us. Never moved up to the mansion, never moved up to the $1 million lifestyle. That's what made him great.
All right, Mark, Alan, and Dan, thank you for joining us tonight, reliving the great Chuck Noll moments with our viewers. A final word now about Chuck Noll. Mel Blount called him a father figure. Joe Green said he was the ultimate leader. In the end, he had the love and respect of every player he coached. You never heard a bad word about Chuck Noll. As a coach, he instilled competence, teamwork, and the attitude that every champion has to have. Personally, he had class and dignity and humility in abundance. He believed that he was, above and beyond everything else, a teacher. He was smart enough to let the players play and smart enough to let the personalities be personalities. But his lessons went far beyond football. Rocky Bleier recalled this weekend that Noll preached to his players that their real success would come in how they raised their children. Yes, it's true. The only head coach to win 4 Super Bowls is underrated. But I don't think Chuck Noll cared. His legacy will speak louder than any of that. Noll used to say that the champions don't do extraordinary work. They just do ordinary work better than everyone else. He did that. And that's the final word on the Subway Final Word. I'm Albie Oxenrider for Dan, Alan, and Mark. See you next time.